it or not. So, the terms fair, the many shades of skin color within the black community: fair, bright, half white, yellow, red bone, tan, skillet blonde, bronze, brown skin, olive, jet black, black, blue black, ink spot, darky. In general, yellow and black seem to be the least desired skin tones, and general attitudes towards skin color were summed up in a popular rhyme from the first part of this century, that is the 20th century when this was written. If you're white, you're all right. If you're yellow, you're mellow. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, get back. So, socioeconomic class, education level, and gender factors modified the expression of these general sentiments. This perspective has been internalized to a great extent by many members within the black community, such that you can see combinations in what it meant to essentially strive and what it meant, in terms of what a desirable mate was, job was, a number of different things. With the most desirable skin color, according to research from the mid to early 20th century, basically desirable skin color is light brown. Not too black, not too light. So Charles Johnson's survey, 2,200 rural black belt children were asked what the best color was to be. The preferred color was light brown. Most dark children saw themselves as brown, and darker brown saw themselves as lighter brown than they were. They even say, well-liked teachers or principals as light brown even when they were darker. Colors on either side of brown met disfavor. It was easily possible to be too white or too black. Now, this meme, we're not just talking about America here. We're also talking about Native America, and we're also talking about Mexico, so within Latino communities as well. But among natives, where we have early race mixing, so the Dawes rolls, which we're going to basically be studying a little later next term, enumerated native populations. Natives who appeared too black were placed in the darky tent, where all trace of their native blood bureaucratically disappeared, and they were placed on the freedman roll. So actually they could have been that color without mixture with black people. They could have been considered too dark from the point of view of the Dawes folks, but because they had mixed with Africans and escaped African slaves, they often did become darker. So this practice led to attitudes where colorism was infused within native populations where it didn't exist before. So natives valued white native mixtures over black or Mexican mixtures among such populations like the Cherokee and other 5 civilized tribes. And that's why they were also considered civilized. So black and Mexican blood was considered polluting. And this is coming from scientific studies of contemporary Cherokee attitudes. That it's best to marry another Cherokee. Second best is to marry another Indian of any other tribe. Third best was marrying a white person. And then blacks and Mexicans were considered polluting. So this eventually led to purges. Certainly in the late 20th century, where we saw, black Cherokee or black natives within the 5 civilized tribes be purged from the rolls in favor of retaining blonde-haired, blue-eyed Cherokee or others. So colorism has impact today. So when we look at these subconscious attitudes around, among other things, race, color, class, how do we begin to fight them? So as an example, I've described myself as bipolar in the sense that I'm combining all the internalized stuff that I've had to look at in terms that I've just spent the last hour lecturing about, because look, I'm Redbone, but there is no one that is ever going to, if they acknowledge my native heritage at all, and to the degree that I acknowledge myself as native at all, it's for political purposes. I'm not interested in casino money. I'm not interested in getting the car. I'm just making a distinction about political stance of other black Indians. Fanon probably is possible that he's a black Indian because he's from Martinique. But he's a revolutionary psychology doctor, psychiatrist, and Samuel Cartwright I made reference to. So the idea of racist ideology as science and revolutionary psychology as a solution. So if I'm bipolar, I'm basically trying to incorporate both of those frameworks. So Cartwright is the one who basically said blacks were crazy for trying to escape slavery, and Fanon basically created the construct of socio-structural violence, of which colorism is a part. So if I'm bipolar, trying to combine those two irreconcilable differences, right? So within the idea of Cartwright being one of the influences that later became the American Psychological Association, Tryptomania gypticus, slaves are mentally ill for wanting to escape slavery. Slavery improved blacks from a condition of savagery. Basic tenet of Western civilization, whites are superior to non-whites. So Cartwright's work and beliefs, foundational to American psychology, which to this day neither recognizes racism exists or that psychological damage occurs because of racism. So Fanon was a radical humanist, says racism scars and people accept abuse and internalize abuse. So one of his books, Black Skin, White Mask, basically details the internal colonization process and what the process is for healing. And when we talk about health disparities and the idea that started within started back in the 19th century and continues to this day. So for example, for many rural blacks, especially in the South, until you had enough black professionals trained, let me take a step back for a second. What is the professional organization of doctors? Let me rephrase that. How many professional organizations of doctors can you name? So what is the dominant one? AMA, okay. Which stands for? Okay. Is there one for dentists? What is it called?
ADA.
Okay. You may have seen that on the back of a Crest box. This toothpaste is approved by the ADA. Yeah, the ADA exists, right? Yeah. You may not know because maybe your daddy wasn't a black doctor. The AMA did not admit black doctors from the beginning of its history. And didn't to the mid-20th century. Yet, Howard University and other historically black colleges and universities were training black doctors and black dentists. But black doctors and black dentists could not join the ADA or the AMA. So they formed their own organizations. The NMA the NDA. Now, you could read the N as Negro, but it was actually national, right? And they allowed whites to join, because there were whites that did join. And the APA, American Psychological Association, in addition to following suit in terms of discriminating from the beginning of its history, didn't actually have its first black president until the mid-1980s, which kind of gives you an idea of when they started admitting blacks sometime in the late, I believe it was 50s or 60s, after the Civil Rights Movement. Right? So when we talk about health practices, switch the slide, please. Thank you. That's you in the control room. All right? Benevolent deception. Black people would not question white doctors, even when white doctors were deliberately doing things that were deadly or damaging in the interest of science. So, for example, the HeLa cells, which is detailed in the book, the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, electrode implants, drug testing, what was called Mississippi appendectomies, forced sterilization. Let's take, for example, have I referenced the book Medical Apartheid? Oh, well. Let's edit this slide and medical apartheid. What she's talking about in her book, Medical Apartheid, Harriet Washington, she's talking about health practices and experimentation was done on blacks first. Now, as an example, if the speculum, which is a device used for gynecological exams in women, was created by a doctor who used pewter spoons on slave women without anesthesia. So the speculum, that duck-billed thing, right, was created by putting spoons together, and often with sharp edges. And the idea, the theory here, was that since blacks were inferior, they didn't feel pain. So no anesthesia, developing the speculum. And this guy is, part of well, you can read the book yourself. It's in the library, Eugene Public Library. So basically one of her, she's talking about historically who's been used as experimentation for health purposes to develop drugs, procedures, et cetera, et cetera. The idea of Mississippi appendectomies. Well, they weren't removing an appendix, they were actually sterilizing women, and the women were women of color, and also poor whites. Okay, the practice started in Cartwright's time and continued well into the 20th century. So, black bodies, the scientific proving ground for medical advances that benefit white longevity but are not given blacks to prolong their lives. So, counseling that doesn't give relief in the form of allowing venting, building skill from microaggressions, or acknowledging that racism exists is part of, for example, sociostructural violence. So, when Fanon talks about violence, and the reason I'm going into this detail about this is actually to help you not just, let's move away from just looking at the dates and all that other kind of stuff, but look at the systems that were laid down in this particular time. So Fanon writes, human violence occurs at personal, institutional and structural levels. Personal violence is the easiest to discern and control, and its effects are easiest to assess. So typically what he's saying is that we think of violence as either a personal thing where there's a perpetrator and a victim. So it happens on an individual level. What we don't necessarily think of is that systems create violence too, and that violence is normalized. So, thinking of violence between individuals instead of systems perpetrating violence on people. Okay, so slavery, apartheid, segregation, or socially sanctioned violence against women. So domestic violence, date rape, sexual assault are not considered violence that society will eradicate because society allows the conditions, that is knowledge, ignorance, also certain form of education that supports it, attitudes and beliefs that perpetuate it and protect it, like lynching was protected and replicated through social structures that remain in place. So the forces that basically support domestic violence, date rape, and sexual assault are basically like the same forces that supported lynching, except the target is different. So public health strategy then is strengthening the host by giving the potential victim or target knowledge, skills, and abilities largely not used, and the sanctions against perpetrator can be nullified according to race, social class, or position. So white males are protected if the targets are white or minority women, particularly in college, who's believed that the perp is a serial rapist in college, and they do exist. Okay, who's believed, the victim or the perp? Why is it set up like that? So institutional and structural violence is a higher order phenomenon that's assume and supersede personal violence. So examples of microsocial systems in which institutional violence occurs: prisons, mental ill institutions, and the family, and also the schools. So it's a form of structural violence is a feature of social structures. Form of violence is inherent in the established modes of social relations, distribution of goods and services, and legal practices of dispensing justice. So, for example, when Martin Luther King talked about poverty is violence, it was basically echoing some of the structures that essentially started within the time period that we're studying and have been refined as we went along. So, hidden but lethal inequities which can lead to the death of those who lack power or influence in society. So, institutional violence and structural violence involve more complex relations, processes than personal violence. All right, so the idea then is looking at cultural competency, where if you're in an institution, so Terry Cross is a Native American social service person who basically studied Indian Child Welfare Act. And so one of the things that he noted, he created a continuum where basically on the nastiest end of the continuum on the left, a culturally destructive organization basically has active participation in the destruction of other cultures. And then on the other end, well, if I guess move, so cultural incapacity, so it's a paternal posture towards group and the minority. So there's ignorance of and unrealistic fear of people of color in particular, but also of others within that particular system, depending on what other things are into play. So colorism, gender, sexual diversity could fall into that as well. So there's lower expectations of culturally different clients. His framework is oriented towards counselors and therapists primarily, but it also works for schools. So most institutions, including this one, basically operate at the American default position is cultural blindness. So color or culture makes no difference. Belief that conventional approaches are universally applicable despite the past history. In fact, contemporary psychology would ignore the fact that Samuel Cartwright existed at all, and ignores cultural strengths and blames the culture and the client for the problem. Cultural pre-competence attempts to improve some aspects of service, may believe that the accomplishment of one goal or activity, like a class or a few classes, hiring a staff member, writing a mission statement, saying diversity is part of our core values, is so one or two cosmetic changes without really changing the system. Then cultural competence, accepts and respect cultural diversity, continuous self-assessment for knowledge and skill building, actively involving cultural groups and allowing the use of culturally specific technology. And then cultural proficiency, being able to assist other systems and individuals within the system to develop cultural competence, and advocates for cultural responsiveness throughout its own system and other systems. So part of looking at, the construct, which we've seen this before, what I was saying within colorism, the basic meme is basically saying, okay, the one-drop rule within colorism is that, right, if you're 1/64th, that is, your great-great-great-great-great-grandparents were full black, then that qualifies you for discrimination within the South, within the time period, and this is where that started, the one-drop rule. But there were different rules applied to different people. So, it's not that black blood is stronger than native blood or Hawaiian blood. So 1/8 Indian for the purpose of removing tribal land rights, but if you're half black and half Indian, well, you're not Indian at all. You're all black. If you're half Hawaiian, you're not Hawaiian anymore. So it's not that black blood is stronger than native or Hawaiian blood. It's the logic of discrimination, which is not necessarily scientifically factually true, but still has some legal power. And we remember basically the whole thing against race mixing with Samuel Thurston. So again, this is all part and parcel of the same idea as some of these that still have currency today. So when we look at civil rights struggle in Oregon during this time period, right? So we had racial exclusion laws. That's how the state was founded, selectively applied to some people who were able to escape that. So you had a group called the Knights of the Golden Circle, which basically wanted to create a confederacy of slave-owning states throughout the South and also in southern Oregon, starting about the Douglas County line and going south to the California border. Ku Klux Klan, which didn't so much operate here and start until the 20th century. There are two forms of discrimination that really more come into, that start actually in this time period, but we start seeing it as a result of the Jim Crow laws. And so noting the difference between the two, de facto, let me edit this, de facto and de jure. So noting the difference between those things, even though de facto and de jure, they're Latin, I'm going to use Ebonics. De facto is defects. Okay, and de jure is de lao. Okay, de facto and de jure segregation. Came out of the Black Codes and Jim Crow. So the law actually made segregation legal, But then when the laws were made illegal, even in the 1800s, defects were that discrimination remained in place. Okay? So we had a civil rights bill in 1875 as well as 1865, which was the law of the land. They were federal laws. Why then did we need to have a civil rights bill in 1965? De jure and the facts. Despite what the law said, the facts were people were still being discriminated against using all the tactics that I've described. You could pass for white. You could pass for lots of different things and your social class also made you also enabled to be somewhat mobile as well. Okay, so you're visible in the past, you can be viable in the present and future. If you can see yourself in the curriculum, develop skills from the curriculum, you can also change the future. So African Americans were present before the founding of the state of Oregon. So who gets remembered and made visible and who's forgotten in mainstream Oregon history? So there are the visible ones. So Marcus Lopez, who is Captain Gray's cabin boy. York, William Clark's slave or manservant. Moses Harris. Jacob Vanderpool, okay, who was a Salem, Oregon businessman deported in 1851 under the exclusion laws. And in Eugene, Wiley Griffin. So there were actually African Americans in Eugene from its founding, so it's illegal for them to be in Oregon. A few African Americans lived in Eugene before Wiley Griffin, and Wiley Griffin is the first one noted in the historical record. So there are enough black people for the newspaper, that is the Morning Register, to ask their opinion about the end of slavery, that is the Emancipation Proclamation. But the paper chose not to print their names. And then, so there were several of them, as the paper quotes, but didn't print their names. And so the first African American to be publicly acknowledged was Wiley Griffin. We talk about him yet? Okay. So, in February 1891, the city granted a franchise to Henry Holden to construct and operate a street railway system. On June 26th, the line opened for business, and with mule-drawn trolleys traveling down Willamette Street from the train depot to 11th Avenue and east to the university. One of Eugene's African-American residents, so note the plural, one of them was one of several mule car drivers, Wiley Griffin, the ebon-hued, notice the colorism, ebony, wood that's dark brown to black. The ebon-hued muleteer and obsequious Chesterfield of the system, vainly seeking to coax a spasmodic burst of speed out of the perverse long-eared critter that is the mule, was a common sight along the early streetcar route. This line was closed in 1903, and the cars and the rails were purchased for use at the Black Butte mines. So, obsequious, Chesterfield. Obsequious is excessively eager to please or to obey all instructions. There's several references to within the dictionary, but not in the dictionary. Since Chesterfield is not a sofa or a coat, and he's not a coat or nor a sofa, most black Americans smoked Chesterfield than any other cigarette until World War II. So I'm noticing there is a racial code within that. So Chesterfield was a cigarette associated with black people. And the reference that I found actually talked about white people not even wanting to smoke Chesterfields because that was a, quote, nigger cigarette. So the coded reference to the obsequious Chesterfield is, I trust, obvious. So that's a picture of Wiley Griffin.